The tragedy of Princess Marie of Orléans did not begin with her death in a cold Danish palace in 1909. It did not even begin on her wedding day, 24 years earlier. It began, as so many royal tragedies do, with the crushing weight of a legacy she did not choose and a bloodline that was as much a curse as it was a blessing. It is a peculiar thing to be born a princess without a kingdom. Marie was born on January 13, 1865, at Morgan House on Ham Common, then in Surrey, England. She was a child of the House of Orléans, one of Europe's most prominent royal houses, yet her first view of the world was one of exile. Her family were refugees in silk, kings in waiting, who lived out of packed trunks, their eyes perpetually turned across the English Channel, toward a France that had rejected them. This atmosphere of waiting defined Marie's soul before she could even speak. Her father, Robert, Duke of Chartres, was a man consumed by the phantom limb of his lost birthright. He was a soldier, a warrior who had fought for the Union in the American Civil War, a man of action, trapped in the stagnant air of an English drawing room. He raised his daughter not as a delicate flower of the aristocracy, but as a vessel for his own frustrated ambition. From her earliest years, it was clear that Marie was a mistake of gender. She possessed the spirit of a general trapped in the body of a girl. While her sisters and cousins were content with needlepoint and the soft murmuring gossip of courtly life, Marie was obsessed with the tangible, violent world of men. She demanded to learn how to ride, and not just to ride, but to conquer the animal beneath her. She studied history with a forensic intensity, analyzing battles and political treaties, fueled by a fierce, almost fanatical Catholicism that convinced her that her family was divinely ordained to rule. She grew up in a house of ghosts. The conversations at the dinner table were always about when we return, about the glories of the past, and the inevitable restoration of the future. But for a young girl with a fire burning in her chest, the past was a boring place to live. Marie wanted the present. She wanted to bite into the apple of life and taste the juice, but she was surrounded by adults who were content to starve on memories. This friction created a personality that was at once dazzling and exhausting. She was loud. She was opinionated. She laughed too hard and argued too passionately. In the polite society of the late 19th century, a woman like Marie was dangerous. She was a new woman born 50 years too early, a bohemian soul corseted into the rigid expectations of the Second Empire. She scared the young men who came to court her. They wanted a wife who would sit quietly and look pretty. Marie looked at them with eyes that seemed to be measuring their intellectual weight and finding them wanting. By the time she reached her 20th birthday, Marie d'Orléans had become a problem. She was too old, too intense, and too poor, her family's wealth having been drained by exile, to be a prime catch on the royal marriage market. She was a piece of high-value artillery with nowhere to aim. Thousands of miles to the north, in the windswept kingdom of Denmark, another problem was brewing, one that would fatally intersect with Marie's destiny. King Christian IX of Denmark, known to history as the father-in-law of Europe, was a man who viewed his children as chess pieces. He had successfully placed his daughters on the thrones of Russia and Great Britain, and his eldest son was the king of Greece. He was the master architect of European dynasties. But he had one piece left on the board that refused to move, his youngest son, Prince Valdemar. Prince Valdemar was the enigma of the Danish court. At 27 years old, he was handsome in a melancholic, reserved way, with deep-set eyes and a neatly trimmed beard that gave him the air of a thoughtful professor rather than a prince. But Valdemar was a man made of silence. He hated the pomp of the court. He loathed the stiff collars and the endless state dinners. His only true happiness was found on the deck of a ship, surrounded by the gray expanse of the ocean and the rough, uncomplicated camaraderie of sailors. The king and queen were worried. It was not just that Valdemar was unmarried. It was that he showed an alarming indifference to the entire institution of marriage. He seemed to lack the spark for women. He was too gentle, too internal. Rumors, those invisible assassins of the royal court, were beginning to circulate. Why did the prince prefer the company of his stable boys and naval cadets? Why did he flee the ballroom the moment the music started? Christian IX decided that the solution to Valdemar's problem was a strong wife. He needed a woman who could do the heavy lifting, a partner who could manage the social obligations that terrified his son. He didn't need a wallflower. He needed a firecracker. He needed someone to wake Valdemar up. And so, the map of Europe was scanned. The matchmakers, cynical architects of human misery, drew a line between the fiery, unwanted princess in France and the silent, reluctant prince in Denmark. It was a match made on paper, a calculation of bloodlines and dowries that ignored the fundamental laws of human chemistry. They thought they were balancing the equation, fire and ice, north and south, Catholic and Lutheran. They didn't realize they were building a bomb. The courtship, if one could call it that, was a comedy of errors played out against the backdrop of the Château d'Eu in Normandy, where Marie's family was staying after they had been allowed to return to France. Valdemar traveled to France in 1885 to meet Marie in what was a carefully managed dynastic match. He arrived in his naval uniform, looking every inch the Viking hero that Marie had read about in her romantic novels. Marie, starved for a hero, projected everything she wanted onto this quiet man. When Valdemar sat silently at dinner, Marie interpreted his lack of conversation as a sign of profound, brooding intelligence. She thought he was a deep soul, a man of mystery who was holding back oceans of emotion. She didn't realize that the silence was not depth, it was absence. He wasn't holding back. He just had nothing to say to her. Valdemar, for his part, was overwhelmed. He had never met a woman like Marie. She was a whirlwind of energy, talking about politics, art, and horses in a rapid-fire French that left him dizzy. But he was a dutiful son. He saw a woman who was capable, strong, and seemingly eager to take charge. To a man who wanted nothing more than to hide, a wife who loved the spotlight seemed like the perfect shield. If she was making noise, perhaps no one would notice his silence. The deal was struck. The negotiations were finalized. A cynical compromise was reached regarding religion. Their sons would be raised Lutheran to satisfy the Danish court, and their daughters would be Catholic to satisfy Marie's piety. They were dividing their unborn children like spoils of war before they had even shared a bed. The wedding took place on October 20th, 1885, in a civil ceremony in Paris, followed by a religious one at the Château d'Eu. It was the social event of the season. The great and the good of European royalty gathered to witness the union of the Bourbon-Orléans and the Glucksburgs. Marie looked radiant, her face flushed with the triumph of finally having a role to play. She was no longer the exile's daughter. She was Her Royal Highness, Princess Valdemar of Denmark. But the cracks in the facade appeared almost immediately. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but emotionally true, about the wedding night. It is the moment where the fairy tale usually fades to black. But for Marie and Valdemar, it was the moment the lights were turned on, revealing the stark emptiness of the room. Marie, passionate, romantic, and physically vital, waited for her husband. She expected the Viking to claim her, to match her intensity with his own. She was prepared for passion. What she got was politeness. Valdemar performed his duty. He was, after all, a naval officer who who followed orders. But there was no fire. There was no connection. It was a biological transaction, executed with a detached gentleness that was far more wounding than cruelty. Marie lay in the dark next to a man who was already asleep, and realized with a sickening jolt that she was alone. The mystery she had fallen in love with was a mirror. She had been looking at her own reflection projected onto a blank canvas. The journey to Denmark was a funeral procession for her romantic illusions. As the royal yacht steamed northward, leaving the warmth of France for the gray, biting winds of the Baltic, Marie stood on the deck, watching the horizon. Valdemar spent the voyage on the bridge with the captain, discussing navigation and currents, his eyes lighting up in a way they never did when he looked at his new wife. When they arrived in Copenhagen, the reception was rapturous. The Danes were curious about this French princess. They lined the streets, waving flags, cheering for the young couple. Marie, ever the performer, turned on the charm. She smiled, she waved, she played the part to perfection. But inside the carriage, sitting next to her stone-faced husband, the cold was already seeping into her bones. They settled into the Yellow Palace, a modest 18th century mansion in the Amaliagade, close to the harbor. The early months of the marriage were a study in psychological isolation. The Danish court was stiff, formal, and deeply conservative. Queen Louise, Valdemar's mother, was a matriarch of the old school who believed that a princess's duty was to be decorative and silent. Marie was neither. She found the court boring, the etiquette stifling, and the weather depressing. But the greatest source of her misery was the man she shared her bed with. Valdemar was not a bad man. In fact, he was universally described as kind and gentle. But he was impenetrable. He treated Marie with the courteous distance one might afford a visiting dignitary. He did not understand her art. He was bored by her political theories. And physically, he retreated. Marie, a woman of immense physical energy, found herself pacing the halls of the Yellow Palace like a caged tigress. She tried to provoke him. She would express radical opinions at dinner just to see him flinch. She would wear daring fashions. She would smoke cigarettes in the drawing room, blowing smoke rings into the stale air of the court. Valdemar would simply smile his sad, weary smile and retreat to his study, or worse, retreat to his ship. He left her often. The Navy was his escape. Whenever the emotional demands of his wife became too much, Valdemar would volunteer for a long voyage. He would sail to the West Indies, to the Mediterranean, to the Far East, leaving Marie alone in Copenhagen for months at a time. It was during these long, lonely absences that the transformation began. Marie realized that if she continued to wait for Valdemar to love her, she would wither and die like a plant in a cellar. She had two choices. She could become the bitter, neglected wife, fading into the background, or she could become something else entirely. She looked at herself in the mirror one morning, perhaps noting the first lines of tension around her mouth, the hardening of her eyes, and made a decision. If she could not be the wife of Prince Valdemar in the way she had dreamed, she would be Prince Valdemar's partner. She would be his comrade. But more than that, she would be a force of nature that no one in Denmark could ignore. She decided to stop being a French princess and start being a phenomenon. The Fire Princess was about to be born, rising from the ashes of a marriage that had burned out before it even began. But as Marie prepared to set the world on fire to keep herself warm, she was unaware that fate was preparing another twist. A giant was coming. A man who would offer Valdemar everything Marie could not, and who would force her to make the most painful bargain of her life. By the late 1880s, the Yellow Palace had settled into a rhythm of polite estrangement. To the outside observer, Prince Valdemar and Princess Marie were the picture of a successful royal couple. They had done their dynastic duty with ruthless efficiency. Between 1887 and 1895, Marie gave birth to 5 children: Age, Axel, Eric, Vigo, and Margaretha. The succession was secure, the lineage was safe, but inside the nursery, and more importantly, inside the master bedroom, the air was frigid. The children were produced, it seemed, out of obligation rather than passion, biological milestones marked on a calendar of duty. Once the necessary heirs were provided, the intimacy, sparse as it was, evaporated almost completely. Valdemar retreated further into his shell, using his naval career as a shield against the emotional demands of a wife he could not love. He was a man sleepwalking through his own existence, a figure of impeccable manners and crushing loneliness. Marie, with her artistic soul and fiery temperament, was starving. She filled the void with her painting, her children, and her eccentric hobbies, but the core of her life was empty. The marriage was a hollow structure, a beautiful house with no fire in the hearth. It seemed destined to continue this way for decades, a long, slow drift into a cold, respectable old age. But destiny has a way of disrupting the most carefully laid plans. Just as the cement was hardening around their lives, a new player entered the stage. He did not come quietly. He arrived with the force of a tidal wave, crashing into the stagnant waters of the Danish court and shattering the polite silence of Valdemar's life forever. He was not a mistress. He was not a political rival. He was family. In 1883, King George I of Greece, Valdemar's older brother, made a decision that would inadvertently change the course of 3 lives. He decided to send his second son back to his ancestral homeland of Denmark to join the Royal Navy. The boy's name was Prince George of Greece. To understand the impact George had on the Danish court, one must appreciate the sheer physical reality of the man. Prince George was a phenomenon. Standing nearly 6'5" in an era when the average man was significantly shorter, he was a giant. He possessed immense physical strength, earning him the family nickname Hercules. But his personality was even larger than his frame. George was loud, boisterous, emotionally volatile, and completely lacking in the stiff upper lip that defined the northern courts. He laughed loudly, cried openly, and loved ferociously. He was still a boy when he arrived in Copenhagen, sent to train with the Royal Danish Navy under Valdemar's care. Valdemar, his uncle, was tasked with mentoring him. The age gap between them was negligible. Valdemar was only 11 years older than his nephew. In the context of royal generations, they were contemporaries rather than authority figure and subordinate. The contrast between them was comical to behold. Valdemar was slender, elegant, reserved, and softly spoken, the cool, gray Baltic Sea. George was massive, clumsy, loud, and physically imposing, the hot, volatile Mediterranean sun. On paper, they should have had nothing in common. Valdemar should have found George exhausting, and George should have found Valdemar boring. But chemistry is a mysterious alchemist. When these two opposites collided, they didn't repel each other. They fused. The bond was instantaneous and terrifyingly deep. From the moment George entered Valdemar's orbit, the lonely Danish prince seemed to wake up from a lifelong slumber. It was as if George possessed the specific key required to unlock the fortress of Valdemar's heart. Where Marie's intensity had caused Valdemar to retreat, George's intensity drew him out. Perhaps it was because George demanded nothing from him socially. There was no need for courtly etiquette or intellectual debate. George offered simple, unadulterated adoration. For George, Valdemar was everything. He was the cool, sophisticated older brother he idolized, the mentor who guided him through the complexities of naval life, and the emotional anchor in a foreign land. George's devotion was absolute. He followed Valdemar everywhere. He mimicked his mannerisms. He looked at him with a gaze of such naked affection that it made courtiers blush. In the sexually repressed atmosphere of the late Victorian era, such intense male friendships were often categorized as romantic friendships, a socially acceptable label that allowed men to form deep emotional bonds without the stigma of homosexuality. But even by the standards of the time, the intensity between Valdemar and George was notable. They became inseparable. When Valdemar went to sea, George found a way to be assigned to the same ship. When they were on land, they were constantly in each other's company. It didn't take long for the relationship to migrate from the naval barracks to the domestic sphere. Prince George essentially moved into the Bernstorff and Yellow Palaces. He wasn't just a weekend guest, he became a fixture of the household, a permanent resident in all but name. To the staff and the children, he was Uncle George, the fun, loud giant who would throw the boys into the air. The dynamic of the household shifted radically. The vast, echoing silences that had plagued the marriage of Valdemar and Marie were suddenly filled with George's booming laughter and heavy footsteps. The dinner table became a lively stage for George's stories and Valdemar's quiet amusement. George brought life into the mausoleum. However, his presence also brought a complex new tension. George was possessive. He was jealous of anyone who took Valdemar's attention away from him, and that included Valdemar's wife. In the early days, there were reports of friction. George would sulk if Valdemar spent too much time with Marie. He would physically position himself between them, a massive human barrier, ensuring that his Uncle Valdi remained in his orbit. This was the moment of crisis for Princess Marie. Most wives would have revolted. Most wives would have demanded that the husband choose between his spouse and his nephew. Marie d'Orléans was a princess of France, a woman of immense pride and fire. She had the social standing and the wealth to demand George's expulsion. She could have made Valdemar's life a misery. She could have caused a scandal that would have rocked the courts of Europe. But Marie did something extraordinary. She watched. She observed the change in her husband. She saw the light in his eyes when George entered the room, a light she had tried for years to kindle, but failed. She saw how Valdemar relaxed, how he laughed, how the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders when the giant was nearby. And in a moment of profound psychological insight, and perhaps profound heartbreak, she realized the truth. George was not the enemy of her marriage. He was the solution to it. She understood that Valdemar was incapable of loving her in the way she wanted, not out of malice, but out of nature. She recognized that George provided Valdemar with the emotional sustenance he needed to survive. If she took George away, she wouldn't get Valdemar back. She would just get the cold, empty shell of him again. So Marie opened her arms and welcomed the giant in. She adopted George. She treated him not as a rival, but as an unruly eldest child. She laughed at his jokes. She managed his moods. She allowed him to take the center stage in Valdemar's life without complaint. This was the birth of the Royal Triangle. Marie coined the phrase that would become the motto of their new life. We are comrades. It was a reconfiguration of marriage. They were partners in running the estate, partners in raising the children, and partners in managing George. By accepting the situation, Marie regained her power. She stopped being the rejected wife and became the matriarch of a very strange, very modern family unit. The three of them settled into a domestic rhythm that defied explanation. They traveled together, the tall blonde prince, the dark eccentric princess, and the massive Greek sailor. They were photographed together constantly. In public, they looked like a close-knit extended family. In private, they were a functional triad. Valdemar had his soulmate in George. George had his idol in Valdemar. And Marie had her freedom. Freed from the burden of trying to be Valdemar's romantic ideal, Marie poured her passion into other outlets. This is where the legend of the Fire Princess truly begins. If she could not burn in the bedroom, she would burn in the world. She became obsessed with testing the limits of her own courage. She became a skilled artist, painting landscapes and portraits with a moody, impressionistic style that hinted at her inner turmoil. But art was too passive. She needed adrenaline. She began to ride horses with a recklessness that terrified her grooms. She would take the most difficult stallions and break them, riding for hours through the forests of Bernstorff until both she and the horse were exhausted. And then there was the fire. Marie developed a fascination with firefighting that bordered on mania. Whenever the alarm bells rang in the nearby village of Gentofte, the princess would leap into action. She had a custom-made uniform. She would rush to the scene, often beating the fire brigade, and dive into the smoke and flames to help save livestock and thatched roofs. The image was irresistible to the press, a royal princess covered in soot, commanding men fighting the primal element of fire. The public adored her. They called her the Fire Princess. They saw it as heroic charity. But looking back in hindsight, the pattern is hard to miss. Marie was a woman fighting a fire she couldn't put out. She was courting danger because it made her feel something other than the dull ache of rejection. Every time she ran into a burning building, she was proving that she was alive, that she was brave, that she mattered. But while the comradeship with George and Valdemar stabilized her home life, it did not satisfy her intellect. Marie was too smart to be just a firefighter. She needed a stage that matched her ambition. And so she turned her eyes to the most dangerous game of all, politics. This was the era of the great game, of secret alliances and shifting borders. Denmark was officially neutral, but Marie was not. She was French, and she hated Germany. She saw herself as an agent of influence, a woman who could use her position to tilt the balance of power in favor of her beloved France. She began to host dinners that were more than just social gatherings. They were diplomatic summits. She charmed the Russian ambassadors, the British envoys, and the French attachés. She spoke their languages, she knew their secrets, and she wasn't afraid to use them. She became a conduit for information whispering in the ears of the powerful, but this political activism brought her into contact with another man, a man who would complicate the emotional geometry of her life even further. His name was Prince Philippe, Duke of Orléans. He was her brother. Philippe was the pretender to the French throne, the man who would be king if the Republic ever fell. He was handsome, dashing, and deeply controversial. He was also banned from entering France. Marie adored him. Their bond was fierce, loyal, and, according to some whispers, uncomfortably close. Marie became Philippe's champion in the north. She worked tirelessly to rehabilitate his image, to secure funding for his cause, and to keep the dream of a Bourbon restoration alive. But in doing so, she made powerful enemies. The Danish government was terrified of offending Germany. The Germans viewed the House of Orléans as a threat. By aligning herself so publicly with her brother, Marie was painting a target on her back. There were rumors, never proven, but persistent, that Marie's involvement went beyond sisterly support. Was she funneling Danish money to the French royalists? Was she passing secrets? The Fire Princess was playing with a different kind of fire now, one that could burn down not just a barn, but a dynasty. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Yellow Palace was a house of secrets. In one room, Valdemar and George sat together, locked in their world of naval charts and silent devotion. In another, Marie paced the floor, writing coded letters to Paris, plotting the restoration of a king, her mind buzzing with morphine and adrenaline. They were comrades, yes, but they were comrades on a sinking ship. The pressure was mounting. Marie's health was beginning to fray under the strain of her manic lifestyle. The political clouds over Europe were darkening, and the delicate balance of the triangle was about to be tested by the one thing they couldn't control: the inevitable passage of time and the intrusion of the real world. The golden age of their strange arrangement was ending. The tragedy was about to begin. The first decade of the 20th century was a deceptive time in Europe. It was the Edwardian era, a period often remembered as a golden afternoon of garden parties, heavy silks, and unshakable empires. To the casual observer, the royal triangle at the Danish court seemed to be basking in this same glow. Prince Valdemar, Princess Marie, and Prince George had defied the odds. They had taken a scandalous situation, a husband who loved his nephew, and a wife who loved power, and domesticated it. They had constructed a sanctuary against the world, rewriting the rules of royal marriage to suit their own survival. They traveled together, the three musketeers of the North, the silent, handsome uncle, the boisterous giant nephew, and the brilliant, eccentric wife who orchestrated their lives like a conductor. They appeared to have won. They had found a way to be happy, or at least functional, in a system designed to make them miserable. But stability in a royal court is often an optical illusion. While the surface of their lives appeared calm, time was the one enemy Marie could not charm, and duty was the one enemy Valdemar could not ignore. The first crack in their carefully constructed world came not from inside the Yellow Palace, but from the volatile politics of the Mediterranean. In 1898, the great powers of Europe made a decision that would tear the triangle apart physically, if not emotionally. They appointed Prince George of Greece as the High Commissioner of Crete. The island was a powder keg of nationalism and violence, torn between the Ottoman Empire and Greece. It needed a strong hand, and the European monarchs decided that the giant Hercules was the man for the job. For George, this appointment was a prison sentence. It meant leaving Denmark. It meant leaving Valdemar. For 8 long years, George was forced to live in a governor's palace in Crete, dealing with insurrections, assassinations, and diplomatic nightmares. He was a man who hated politics, trapped in the most political job in the world. But his physical exile gives us, the historians of today, the clearest window into the true nature of his bond with Valdemar. Because they were apart, they had to write. The letters that flew between Crete and Copenhagen during this period are not the correspondence of an uncle and a nephew. They are the desperate, bleeding cries of a soulmate severed from his other half. George, a man known for his brute strength and loud laughter, fell apart on the page. He wrote of his profound loneliness, his hatred of his duties, and his desperate need to be back with Uncle Valdi. He described Valdemar as his anchor, his son, his reason for existing. Valdemar's responses, though typically more reserved, he was always the cautious one, the master of the unspoken, were the lifeline George clung to. Valdemar was the calm voice soothing the giant's tantrums across the continent, reassuring him that his place in the Yellow Palace was being kept warm, that he had not been replaced. Whenever the pressure became too much, George would flee. He would claim exhaustion or illness or a diplomatic emergency and rush back to Denmark. The moment he crossed the threshold of the Bernstorff Palace, the High Commissioner vanished, and Valdi's boy returned. The color would return to his cheeks. The laughter would return to his throat. Marie would welcome him back with open arms, knowing that her husband was only truly at peace when his shadow returned. But the world would not let them be. The dynastic pressure on Prince George was mounting. He was approaching 40. He was a prince of Greece. He was unmarried. In the royal calculus of the era, an unmarried prince was a wasted asset and a source of dangerous rumors. The courts of Europe began to whisper, why was the giant prince still single? Why did he spend all his holidays with his uncle? The pressure from Athens and Copenhagen became irresistible. George had to marry. The triangle was about to be forced into a square. In 1907, Prince George finally capitulated. He agreed to take a wife. But true to form, his choice of bride was as unconventional as everything else in his life. He did not choose a docile German princess. He chose Princess Marie Bonaparte. Marie Bonaparte was not royal in the traditional sense. She was the great-grandniece of Napoleon Bonaparte, a name that still caused shudders in the legitimate courts of Europe. But she was something more important. She was the heiress to the vast Blanc casino fortune. She was fabulously wealthy, fiercely intelligent, and deeply neurotic. Later in life, she would become a famous psychoanalyst and a disciple of Sigmund Freud. But in 1907, she was simply a brilliant, lonely woman looking for a title to match her money. The marriage was a transaction. George needed money and a shield against the rumors. Marie Bonaparte needed social standing. But what happened on their wedding night has become legendary in the annals of royal psychology, a moment of brutal honesty that shattered any illusion of a traditional union. Some later accounts describe George's attachment to Valdemar as unusually intense for the era, though the most dramatic details vary by source. Prince George, the giant Hercules, sat on the edge of the bed and wept. He did not cry for his lost bachelorhood. He cried for Valdemar. In a confession that must have been terrifying to hear, he allegedly told his bewildered new bride that he could never truly love her because his heart belonged entirely to his uncle in Denmark. He confessed the depth of his attachment then and there in the bridal chamber. He told her that she would always be second. Most women would have fled. They would have sought an annulment immediately. The shame would have been unbearable, but Marie Bonaparte was a scientist of the human soul. Instead of being repulsed, she was fascinated. She looked at this broken giant weeping for his uncle and saw not a monster, but a complex psychological case study. She accepted George's confession. She accepted the terms. She realized that if she wanted to be Princess George of Greece, she had to accept the ghost of Prince Valdemar in her bed. And so, in a bizarre twist of fate, the two Maries met. Marie d'Orléans, the Fire Princess of Denmark, and Marie Bonaparte, the wealthy intellectual of France. They should have been rivals. Instead, they formed a strange alliance. They were the two women tasked with managing these two codependent men. They understood the assignment. Marie Bonaparte even became fond of Valdemar, realizing that he was not a villain stealing her husband, but a gentle man who was just as trapped as everyone else. But while the men had each other, and the new Marie had her money and her science, Princess Marie d'Orléans was beginning to run out of fuel. By 1908, the Fire Princess was 43 years old, but she looked 60. The years of manic energy, of fighting fires, of riding bulls, of staying up until dawn debating politics, had taken a devastating toll. The human body keeps a ledger, and Marie was deep in debt. She was in pain. Her joints ached from years of hard riding. Her lungs were irritated by decades of chain smoking. She was rarely seen without a cigar or a cigarette in her hand, inhaling the smoke as if it were oxygen. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychic agony of her position. The comrade act was exhausting. For 20 years, she had suppressed her own need for romantic love, channeling it into her children and her politics. But the tank was empty. The adrenaline that had sustained her was gone, replaced by a crushing gray fatigue. To cope, Marie turned to the dark comfort of the era's pharmacopoeia. The whispers in the court grew louder. The princess was taking tonics for her nerves. She was taking drops for her insomnia. It is widely believed that she became dependent on morphine or laudanum, the common scourges of high society women who needed to numb the reality of their gilded cages. The Fire Princess was slowly sedating herself into oblivion. Her behavior became erratic. Her temper, once fiery but charismatic, became brittle and sharp. She would snap at servants. She would retreat into her room for days, the curtains drawn, refusing to see anyone. The Indian summer was over. The winter of her discontent had arrived. And in the background, her political games were catching up with her. Marie had never stopped plotting for the restoration of her family to the French throne. She was the staunchest defender of her brother Philippe, the Duke of Orléans. But Philippe was a chaotic figure, a man who leaped from scandal to scandal. His political maneuvers were clumsy, and by associating herself so closely with him, Marie was dragging the Danish court into dangerous waters. There were rumors that Marie was using her position to pass sensitive information to the French. There were whispers that the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had personally complained about that French woman in Copenhagen. Marie was becoming a liability. The walls were closing in. She was politically isolated, physically broken, and emotionally bankrupt. The year 1909 dawned with a sense of foreboding. The winter was exceptionally cold. Valdemar noticed the change in his wife, but he was powerless to stop it. He sat by her bedside when she had her bad days, holding her hand in his gentle, distant way, but he could not fix what was broken inside her. He could not give her the one thing she needed, a love that burned as hot as hers. George was there too, pacing the hallways, his giant frame filling the small rooms, his face etched with worry. He loved Marie in his own way. She was his friend, his ally, the woman who had made his life with Valdemar possible. He knew that without her, the center would not hold. As the autumn leaves fell in the gardens of Bernstorff, Marie seemed to sense the end was coming. She began to settle her affairs. She wrote letters that sounded like goodbyes. She spent long hours looking at her paintings, the landscapes of a Denmark she had tried so hard to conquer but never quite understood. She was tired. She was so incredibly tired. The fire that had raged for 44 years was flickering. The fuel was gone. And then, in late November, came the cold. It started as a sniffle, a cough, a shiver, ordinary symptoms for a Danish winter. But for a woman whose immune system had been shattered by stress and narcotics, it was the beginning of the end. The stage was set for the final act. The Fire Princess was about to face the darkness, and she would do it as she had done everything else, surrounded by secrets, surrounded by men who loved her but could not save her, and surrounded by the ghosts of the life she could have lived. By the autumn of 1909, the Royal Triangle had moved from the airy bohemian freedom of the Bernstorff Palace to the winter residence in the heart of Copenhagen, the Yellow Palace. If Bernstorff was the stage where Marie had played the role of the vibrant, eccentric artist, the Yellow Palace was the backdrop for a tragedy. It was an 18th century mansion, elegant but gloomy, sitting in the shadows of the Amalienborg complex. It was a house of drafty corridors, heavy velvet curtains, and shadows that seemed to lengthen as the days grew shorter. Princess Marie was 44 years old. In modern terms, she was in the prime of her life. But In the harsh arithmetic of her own existence, she was ancient. The fire that had defined her, the manic energy that drove her to fight literal fires, to ride wild horses, to manipulate European politics, had consumed the vessel that held it. She was a burnt-out shell. The court physicians who attended her in those final months described a woman suffering from nerves and exhaustion. These were the polite medical euphemisms of the Edwardian era, catch-all terms used to describe everything from clinical depression to drug dependency. And indeed, the whispers in the servants' quarters suggested that the princess was surviving on a chemical diet. To combat the crushing insomnia that kept her pacing the floors until dawn, she took heavy sedatives. To combat the lethargy that glued her to her bed during the day, she took stimulants. She was chemically engineering her own survival, trying to force her body to keep up with a spirit that refused to surrender. But the most dangerous symptom wasn't physical, it was spiritual. Marie had lost her purpose. For 20 years, she had been the bridge between Valdemar and George. She had been the translator of their emotions, the buffer that softened the edges of their scandalous bond. But as the two men grew older, they seemed to need her less. Their rhythm was set. They were comfortable in their silence. Marie, the comrade, was becoming a spectator in her own marriage. On a bleak day in late November, the inevitable finally happened. It began innocuously enough, a sneeze, a shiver, a complaint of a sore throat. It was just a cold. The Danish winter was famous for them. But while a healthy woman would have shaken it off with tea and rest, Marie's body had no reserves left to fight. The cold migrated to her chest. Her breathing became ragged. The fire princess, who had once inhaled smoke in burning barns without flinching, was now gasping for air in her own bedroom. The diagnosis shifted rapidly from influenza to pneumonia. The atmosphere in the Yellow Palace transformed overnight. The heavy silence of the daily routine was shattered by the frantic coming and going of doctors, priests, and family members. King Frederick VIII, Valdemar's brother, visited. The Dowager Empress of Russia, Valdemar's sister, sent urgent telegrams. But the true drama was happening inside the sick room. Valdemar, usually so distant, was suddenly, terrifyingly present. He sat by her bedside for hours, holding her hand. Witnesses described him as pale and ghost-like, staring at his wife with an expression of bewildered grief. He was a man who had spent his life avoiding intimacy, yet now, faced with the ultimate separation, he seemed unable to let go. Did he love her? Perhaps not with the burning romantic passion of the poets, but he loved her as the mother of his children, as the architect of his life, and as the only woman who had ever truly understood him. He knew, perhaps more than anyone, that she had sacrificed her happiness to facilitate his. And then there was George. Prince George of Greece was in Copenhagen when the illness struck. He did not flee, he did not hide. He was there right alongside Valdemar. The giant man, who had once been the source of so much tension, was now a pillar of devastation. He paced the hallways, weeping openly, terrified of the void that Marie's death would open up. He knew that she was the keystone of the arch. Without her, the structure of their lives threatened to collapse. As Marie lay dying, drifting in and out of consciousness, the room was thick with the weight of unsaid things. There were no final confessions of love, no dramatic reconciliations. There was only the sound of labored breathing and the presence of the two men who had defined her existence. It was in these final delirious hours that the rumors began to swirl outside the palace gates, rumors that would stain Marie's legacy for decades. Why was she dying so fast? She was strong. She was a fighter. How could a simple cold kill the fire princess in a matter of days? Marie had been a polarizing political figure. She was a French patriot who had openly antagonized the powerful pro-German factions in Denmark. She had enemies in Berlin. Had someone slipped something into her medicine? Had the dark forces she so often warned about finally caught up with her? Had the overdose of medication been accidental, or was it a deliberate exit? Had the comrade finally tired of the charade? Had she looked at the bleak future of a loveless old age and decided to check out on her own terms? While gossip ranged from intrigue to overdose, history records only a body that finally gave up. The Danish court, efficient as ever at protecting its own, drew a veil over the specific circumstances of her end. On the evening of December 4th, 1909, the struggle ended. Princess Marie of Orléans died. She was 44 years old. The moment the breath left her body, the dynamic in the room shifted irrevocably. The three became two. The buffer was gone. The reaction of the two men was a study in contrasting grief. Valdemar turned to stone. He retreated into a silence so profound it was almost catatonic. He was the dutiful widower, performing the rituals of death with mechanical precision, but his eyes were dead. George, on the other hand, fell apart. The Hercules of the family was reduced to a sobbing wreck. He had to be sedated. He clung to Valdemar, not as a nephew comforting an uncle, but as a terrified child clinging to a parent. His grief was so visceral, so outsized, that it made the courtiers uncomfortable. It was the grief of a husband, not a nephew. The funeral of Princess Marie was a grand piece of state theater designed to honor a royal highness, but it also inadvertently exposed the raw, beating heart of the royal triangle to the public. The service was held at Roskilde Cathedral, the ancient brick Gothic burial place of Danish monarchs. The kings and queens of Europe gathered in the freezing nave, their breath visible in the cold air. The organ thundered. The black crape hung from the pillars. Protocol dictated that Prince Valdemar, as the chief mourner, should lead the procession behind the coffin, and he did. He walked with the stiff naval bearing he had perfected over a lifetime. He looked magnificent in his tragedy, the stoic white-bearded prince walking alone. But he wasn't alone. Walking right beside him, not a respectful few paces behind, as etiquette would demand for a nephew, was Prince George. They walked shoulder to shoulder. To the uninitiated, it looked like a nephew supporting his frail uncle. But to those who knew the truth, it was a visual manifesto. They were the two widowers. They were burying their wife. They stood at the graveside as a unit, united in their loss just as they had been united in their life. The children, Aga, Axel, Eric, Vigo, and Margaret, stood nearby, a cluster of confused and heartbroken young people. They had lost the vibrant, colorful center of their world. Their mother, the fire princess who had taught them to be brave, was gone. Their father was a ghost. Their Uncle George was a wreck. The stable, if strange, world of their childhood had vanished overnight. When the coffin was lowered into the crypt, the finality of it hit George with the force of a physical blow. He realized that the sanctuary was breached. Marie had been the one who charmed the world, who distracted the press, who made their arrangement look bohemian rather than scandalous. With her gone, the spotlight would fall squarely on the two men left standing. Valdemar refused to move on. In a gesture of profound Gothic grief, he ordered that Marie's rooms be left exactly as they were at the moment of her death. It became a shrine to the departed. Her painting easel remained in the corner, the oils drying out and cracking on the palette. Her fireman's uniform hung in the wardrobe, smelling of smoke and lavender. Her hairbrushes, still tangled with strands of her dark hair, sat on the vanity. Valdemar would spend hours in these rooms, sitting in her chair smoking his pipe in the dark. He wasn't just mourning Marie, he was mourning the safety she represented. He was mourning the era. For the citizens of Copenhagen, the death of the princess marked a shift in the city's mood. The Fire Princess was gone, replaced by a legend. Stories began to circulate, some true, some exaggerated, about her bravery and her secret sadness. She became a saint of the people, but inside the palace the reality was far less romantic. It was terrifying. George stayed. He knew that if he returned to Greece or his own wife in Paris, Valdemar might fade away completely. So, the giant Greek prince remained in the Yellow Palace, prowling the corridors, trying to fill the silence with his voice. But the dynamic was raw. Without Marie to mediate, the intensity of their bond was unchecked. They were two aging men clinging to each other in the wreckage of their domestic life. Marie had been their shield, handling the press, the politics, and the social obligations. Now, that shield was gone. The whispers about their relationship, which had been a low hum during Marie's life, began to grow louder. Why was Prince George still there? Why did the two princes never leave each other's side? The golden age was truly over. The 19th century had died in that bedroom with Marie. Now, the cold, hard light of the 20th century was streaming in through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the empty air. As the snow fell on Marie's fresh grave in Roskilde, covering the Fire Princess in a blanket of white ice, Valdemar and George retreated into the Yellow Palace and locked the doors. They were about to embark on the final, longest chapter of their lives, a long twilight that would last for another 30 years, a time of wars, revolutions, and a stubborn, defiant love that refused to be extinguished, even when the rest of the world was burning. While the rest of the world rushed headlong into the modern age, automobiles replacing carriages, electricity banishing shadows, time inside Prince Valdemar's home simply stopped. Valdemar, now a widower in his 50s, settled into a routine of profound, deliberate stasis. He became a man out of time. To the citizens of Copenhagen, he was a familiar, almost ghostly figure, the tall, elegant prince with the white navel beard, walking his dogs through the city streets, always polite, always bowing, but surrounded by an invisible wall of silence. He did not remodel the Yellow Palace. He did not pack away Marie's things. He turned their home into a shrine to the comrade who had left them. But this silence was not empty. It was filled with the enduring, agonizing presence of the nephew he loved. If Valdemar was frozen in place, Prince George of Greece was a man adrift. The death of Marie d'Orléans had removed the domestic anchor of their life, but the political chaos of Europe soon stripped George of his other anchor, his homeland. The Greek monarchy was a fragile institution, constantly toppling and being reinstated. In the turbulent years leading up to and following World War I, the Greek royal family faced assassination and exile. For most princes, exile is a tragedy. For Prince George, it was, in a twisted way, a liberation. Banished from Athens with no political role left to play, he effectively became a nomad of high society, and his compass pointed in only one direction: Denmark. With no vice-regal duties in Crete and no court duties in Athens, George began to spend more and more time in Paris and Copenhagen. He became a trans-European commuter, living for the months he could spend at Bernstorff with Uncle Valdi. But the dynamic had shifted. They were no longer the young, dashing naval officers who could pass off their intimacy as camaraderie. They were aging men. George was growing heavier, his hair thinning, his explosive temper mellowing into a grumpy eccentricity. Valdemar was becoming frail, a delicate figure made of parchment and melancholy. Yet eyewitnesses from this period described their reunions as electric. When George arrived at the Yellow Palace, the servants knew the atmosphere would change instantly. Valdemar would light up. The silence would be broken by George's booming voice, retelling stories they had both heard 1,000 times. They would sit for hours in Valdemar's study, surrounded by clouds of tobacco smoke, shutting out the world. While Valdemar and George turned inward, the great dynasty that Valdemar's parents had built, the grandparents of Europe, was collapsing in spectacular bloody fashion. World War I was the death knell for the family business. It pitted cousin against cousin. Valdemar's sister, Queen Alexandra of England, was at war with their nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. But the greatest tragedy struck in Russia. Valdemar's favorite sister was Dagmar, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna of Russia. Valdemar and Dagmar had always been close. They shared the same gentle nature. When the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917, the Romanov dynasty was exterminated. Valdemar watched from the safety of neutral Denmark as his nieces and nephews were butchered in cellars. The news shattered him. The Golden Age was revealed to be a fragile eggshell. When the Empress Dagmar finally escaped Russia, saved by a British battleship sent by her sister Alexandra, she didn't go to London. She came home to Denmark. She came home to Valdemar. For the last years of her life, the Dowager Empress lived at Vidura, a villa she bought near Copenhagen. Valdemar became her constant companion. They were two relics of a vanished world, walking arm in arm along the Danish coast, speaking in Danish, mourning the ghosts of emperors and czars. But even the presence of his beloved sister could not displace George. In fact, the tragedy of the war seemed to make Valdemar cling to George even tighter. In a world where kings could be shot like dogs in a basement, the only safe harbor was love. One of the most fascinating and often overlooked aspects of this story is the fate of Valdemar and Marie's children. They had grown up in the royal triangle, raised by a distant father, a firebrand mother, and a giant Greek uncle. One might expect them to be dysfunctional. Instead, they turned out to be wildly romantic, eccentric, and utterly indifferent to royal protocol. It seems they inherited their mother's bohemian spirit and their father's disregard for convention. Valdemar's sons, Aja, Axel, Eric, and Vigo, proved to be a nightmare for the dynastic planners, but a testament to their parents' unique parenting style. In a rigid royal system where marriage to a commoner meant losing one's title and rights, 3 of Valdemar's 4 sons chose love over duty. They married women who were noble but not royal, or in some cases American commoners. They voluntarily gave up their rights to the throne, taking the lesser title of Counts of Rosenborg. Did Valdemar stop them? Did the stern patriarch forbid these unequal matches? No, he supported them. This is the hidden softness of Prince Valdemar. Having spent his entire life trapped in a duty-bound existence, living a lie to protect the family name, he seemingly refused to force his sons into the same cage. When his son Prince Aga joined the French Foreign Legion, a shocking move for a royal, Valdemar did not disown him. He seemed to understand the need for escape. The children adored Uncle George as well. Even as adults, they maintained a close relationship with the Greek giant, recognizing him as the co-parent he effectively was. The unconventional family unit had produced a generation of free spirits. Meanwhile, George's wife, Marie Bonaparte, who had been watching it all with a notebook in hand, had evolved. By the 1920s, Marie Bonaparte had transformed herself. She was no longer just a wealthy heiress, she was a pioneering psychoanalyst. She used her vast fortune to save Sigmund Freud from the Nazis, and she became one of the leading intellectual figures of her day. She applied her analytical mind to her own marriage. She did not hate Valdemar. In fact, she came to view the relationship between her husband and his uncle as a fascinating psychological case study. In her writings and letters, she analyzed George's arrested development and his fixation on Valdemar. She theorized that Valdemar represented an idealized father figure for George, a safe harbor of unconditional love that George had never received from his own strict father. But beyond the clinical diagnosis, Marie Bonaparte exhibited incredible grace. She facilitated their relationship. She understood that George was impossible to live with when he was away from Valdemar for too long. He became petulant, angry, and depressed. So she encouraged the visits. She realized that for her marriage to function, the other man had to be present. She even became fond of Valdemar herself. She saw his gentleness, his sadness. She recognized that he was not a villain stealing her husband, but a fellow victim of circumstance. In a strange way, the triangle became a quartet of mutual understanding. They were all intelligent people making the best of a complex reality. As the 1920s bled into the 1930s, Prince Valdemar entered his 80s. He became the grand old man of the Danish court. His hair and beard turned snow white. He became frail. The world had become unrecognizable. Jazz was playing on the radio. The Great Depression was ravaging economies. Hitler was rising in Germany. But at the Yellow Palace, Valdemar still dressed in the stiff collars of the 19th century. He still followed the naval rituals. His health began to fail. He suffered from bronchial issues, the same weakness that had taken his wife. George, now in his late 60s, was terrified. The thought of a world without Valdemar was inconceivable to him. He spent as much time as possible in Copenhagen, sitting by the old man's chair, holding his hand, reading to him. The physical passion, if it had ever existed in the way we imagine, had long since transmuted into something deeper and more tender. It was a companionship of souls. They didn't need to speak. They just needed to be in the same room. Valdemar had outlived almost everyone. His parents were long dead. His sisters Alex and Minnie were dead. His wife was dead. He was the last leaf on the tree, but he was not alone. In 1938, Valdemar celebrated his 80th birthday. It was a quiet affair, a celebration of survival, but those close to him saw the end coming. He was tired. The long years of maintaining the mask, of being the Valdemar, the prince who mastered discretion, had worn him down. He had lived through the golden age of kings, the tragedy of wars, and the chaos of revolutions. He had been a husband, a father, a naval officer, and a prince. But his true legacy, the defining act of his life, was not found in the history books or the naval archives. It was sitting in the chair next to him, holding a cup of tea, speaking with a Greek accent. Valdemar was ready to go, but he had one final duty to perform, saying goodbye to the man who had loved him for 50 years. On a cold January day in 1939, the flags across Copenhagen were lowered to half-mast. The air was thick with the threat of snow and darker still with the threat of war. To the south, Nazi Germany was mobilizing. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the catastrophe of the Second World War to begin. But inside the Yellow Palace, a different kind of history was coming to a close. Prince Valdemar of Denmark was dead. He was 80 years old. With his passing, the last living link to the golden age of royalty was severed. He was the last surviving child of the grandparents of Europe. He had outlived his parents, his brothers, and his famous sisters, the queens of England and Russia. He was a man of the 19th century who had lingered, ghost-like, into the modern age. But the true tragedy of that day was not political or dynastic. It was personal. In the room where the old prince lay, surrounded by the naval memorabilia of his youth and the frozen artifacts of his late wife, sat an old man weeping. Prince George of Greece was now 69 years old. For 50 years, half a century, his entire emotional universe had revolved around the man lying in the bed. He had been the nephew, the friend, the comrade, and the soulmate. Now he was the survivor. The funeral was a grand state affair. Valdemar was laid to rest in Roskilde Cathedral in the glorious chapel of the Glücksburg dynasty. He was placed near his wife, Princess Marie. It was the final act of the comrades, reunited in death as they had been in life. But as the coffin was lowered, George stood apart. He had stood beside Valdemar at Marie's funeral 30 years earlier. Now he stood alone. The triangle was reduced to a single point. Prince George survived his uncle by 18 long years. He lived to see the end of World War II, the rise of the Cold War, and the dawn of the atomic age. He lived to see his own nephew, Prince Philip, marry the future Queen Elizabeth II of England. But he never moved on. As he approached his own death in 1957, sitting in his villa in St. Cloud, George began to make preparations. He knew he would be buried in the royal cemetery at Tatoi, outside Athens. He would be buried far away from Valdemar, who lay in the cold stone of Roskilde. He couldn't change that. Protocol dictated their bodies must lie apart, but George found a way to ensure their souls would be together. He gave specific secret instructions to his family regarding his burial. When Prince George died on November the 25th, 1957, at the age of 88, his family carried out his final wish. Inside his coffin, tucked close to his heart, they placed a small silver locket. Inside the locket was a photograph of Prince Valdemar of Denmark, and curled next to the photograph was a lock of Valdemar's hair, cut from his head on the day he died. For 18 years, George had carried that hair with him. It was a Victorian token of love, a piece of the beloved to hold on to. And now he was taking it with him into eternity. And what of Marie? What of the fire princess who started this story? History is often unkind to the beard, the wife who facilitates the husband's secret life. But Marie d'Orléans deserves more than our pity. She deserves our awe. She was a woman who was dealt a hand of cards that would have broken a lesser spirit. She was given a husband who could not love her and a life that tried to silence her. But she refused to fold. She played the hand with a dazzling, dangerous brilliance. She realized that love comes in many forms. It is not always the romantic inferno of the novels. Sometimes love is simply the act of making space for someone else to be happy. Marie d'Orléans, Prince Valdemar, and Prince George formed a constellation of 3 lonely stars who found a way to shine together in the dark. Their story is not a scandal. It is a survival guide. It is a testament to the fact that the human heart is vast, complex, and capable of enduring the impossible as long as it doesn't have to do it alone. They are all gone now. But if you listen closely to the wind whistling through the copper roofs of Copenhagen, you might hear the faint echo of laughter, the deep boom of a giant, the quiet chuckle of a prince, and the sharp, defiant laugh of a woman who decided that if she couldn't have the fairy tale, she would write her own damn story.